I never thought living in a quiet suburban neighborhood would turn into something straight out of a sitcom, but here we are. My wife and I moved into this community about a year ago, drawn by the promise of friendly neighbors, tree-lined streets, and a calm atmosphere that felt miles away from the chaos of the city. For the most part, it's been just that peaceful and comfortable. We enjoy our evening walks, wave hello to familiar faces, and even joined the neighborhood book club, though we quickly realized not everyone shared the same taste in novels. Of course, every neighborhood has its characters, and ours is no exception. Right from the start, there was one person who stood out more than anyone else. Everyone calls her Karen. Not just any Karen, but the archetypal HOA enforcer who seems to believe she has a personal mission to regulate every detail of everyone else's life. She's the type of person who patrols the community rules like a self-appointed sheriff. From lawn heights to mailbox decorations, nothing escapes her notice. We heard stories before moving here about her calling the HOA board to report neighbors for trivial infractions and how she once organized a petition to ban bird feeders because, in her words, they attract unwanted pests. Karen's reputation quickly became a running joke among some neighbors, but it was hard to laugh when she started showing up on our doorstep with complaints barely worth mentioning. She knocked one afternoon, insisting that our front garden was not compliant, because a few weeds had sprung up after a rainy week. My wife, always polite but firm, explained that we were aware and taking care of it. That didn't seem to satisfy Karen, who left with a warning about fines and rule enforcement. We tried to shrug it off as typical HOA fussiness, but it felt like the beginning of something more annoying. Despite Karen's constant presence, we enjoyed living here. The neighborhood was quiet, the kids played in the parks, and most people kept to themselves. My wife, who is calm and confident in any situation, handled these encounters with a level of grace I admired. I often wondered what it was that made Karen so obsessed with the rules, but I didn't expect that one ordinary afternoon would turn into a story we'd be telling for years, all because Karen decided to call 911 on my wife for ignoring the door. Karen was the kind of neighbor who never let a single rule slide, no matter how small or silly it might have seemed to the rest of us. From the moment we moved in, she made sure we knew exactly how things were supposed to be done around here. She carried herself with a certain air of authority that felt less like friendliness and more like a warning. When she talked, it was always with a sharpness that cut through the usual neighborly pleasantries. You could tell she believed that the rules were sacred, and anyone who failed to follow them was somehow beneath her. I quickly learned that Karen's obsession with order didn't come from a place of kindness or wanting to keep the neighborhood nice for everyone. It felt more like a personal crusade, a mission she'd taken on to control everything around her. She would patrol the sidewalks in her golf cart, stopping to inspect each house's mailbox or shrubbery, as if she were inspecting a crime scene. When she spotted something she didn't like, she didn't hesitate to confront the homeowner. I heard stories of her delivering ultimatums to people about trash cans left out too long, or garden gnomes placed incorrectly on front lawns. Nothing escaped her judgment. Her persistence was impressive, if not a little exhausting. It wasn't just about the rules themselves, but the way she wielded them. She seemed to delight in pointing out others' mistakes and reporting them to the HOA board. If you were new or just trying to settle in, you quickly realized that Karen was a force to be reckoned with. Some neighbors tried to keep their distance, while others tolerated her antics with a weary smile. There were a few who tried to stand up to her, but those efforts rarely went well. She had a way of making people feel like they were the ones causing trouble, even when they were simply minding their own business. I often wondered what drove her to act this way. Was it a deep-seated need for control, a way to feel important, or maybe just a habit formed from years of being involved in community politics? Whatever the reason, Karen didn't just enforce rules, she became the embodiment of them. She was quick to judge and slow to forgive, and she carried a self-righteousness that could fill an entire room. What made it worse was how much influence she had over the HOA board. When she filed complaints, they rarely got dismissed. The board seemed to take her side as if she were the neighborhood's guardian angel, even though most of us saw her as a nagging presence that made living here less relaxing. I could tell my wife felt the tension every time Karen showed up. It wasn't just the annoyances, but the way Karen's presence made our home feel less like a refuge and more like a stage for her next performance. Even so, my wife always remained composed. She never let Karen get under her skin the way some neighbors did. I admired that about her because I'm pretty sure I would have snapped by now. But the worst was yet to come. The day when Karen's obsession pushed things too far and changed everything in ways we never could have predicted. My wife has always been the steady one between us. While I can get a little worked up over things, especially when it comes to people like Karen, she has this calm confidence that seems to settle any storm. From the moment I met her, I knew she was someone who carried herself with a quiet strength, the kind that doesn't need to shout or prove itself but simply commands respect by being who she is. She listens more than she talks, and when she does speak, her words are measured and thoughtful, never careless or rushed. She's not just calm, she's incredibly sharp. Her mind works in ways I sometimes struggle to keep up with, always analyzing, always understanding more than she lets on. She has this way of looking at a situation and seeing the pieces that don't quite fit together, the nuances that most people miss. I've seen her navigate tough conversations with that kind of grace that only comes from real experience. People naturally trust her judgment and feel comfortable confiding in her, even if they barely know her. It's something I've admired since the day we met. What most people don't realize right away is just how much she has achieved in her career. She's not only smart and capable, but also incredibly dedicated to serving others. She's worked her way up through some challenging roles, always taking on responsibilities that demanded not just skill, but a strong moral compass and leadership. She's the type who leads by example and doesn't shy away from hard decisions, even when they aren't popular. To me, she is both inspiring and humbling. In our neighborhood, she tends to keep a low profile. She's friendly and polite, but avoids the petty dramas that Karen seems to thrive on. She respects the community and wants it to be a safe and welcoming place, but she doesn't waste time with unnecessary conflicts. Even when Karen knocked on our door to complain or make demands, my wife would listen patiently, respond calmly, and then quietly set boundaries without making a scene. She never raised her voice or got defensive, which only seemed to frustrate Karen more. Little did anyone know, the calm woman Karen so easily dismissed was about to become the central figure in a story that no one here could have seen coming. It started like any other day in our quiet neighborhood, with the sun casting a warm glow on the sidewalks and the occasional sound of birds chirping in the trees. My wife and I had spent the morning doing some yard work and catching up on a few things around the house. I was in the garage tinkering with a project while she was inside, working on her laptop. The doorbell rang, but my wife didn't hear it right away. We had just gotten a new doorbell system that was a bit quieter than the old one, and it sometimes took a few rings to catch her attention. Outside stood Karen, as usual, looking as sharp and serious as ever. She was holding a clipboard and tapping her foot impatiently. When my wife finally got to the door, she greeted Karen politely but didn't immediately open it. Instead, she asked what she needed through the partially cracked window. Karen's expression was one of clear irritation. She told my wife that someone had reported her for ignoring the door, which, as far as Karen was concerned, was suspicious behavior. She implied that not answering quickly enough was a sign that something was wrong or that we might be involved in something shady. My wife explained calmly that she had just been busy and hadn't heard the bell ring until just now. She assured Karen there was nothing wrong and that she would be happy to talk about any concerns she had. Karen, however, was not satisfied. Her eyes narrowed, and she began listing off complaints she claimed to have heard from other neighbors' rumors about our household, questions about our comings and goings. It was clear to me later that Karen had been watching us more closely than we realized. Despite my wife's reassurances, Karen's tone grew sharper. She insisted that because my wife had not opened the door immediately, she had a right to escalate the matter. She pulled out her phone and told my wife that she was going to call 911 to report suspicious activity. My wife's calm demeanor didn't falter, but I could see the surprise flicker in her eyes. Karen was serious, and she wasn't backing down. By the time I came inside, I could hear Karen on the phone, her voice low but firm, as she explained to the dispatcher that there was a potential security issue at our house. I stepped forward and asked Karen what she thought she was doing. She turned to me with that same look of self-righteousness and said, "I'm protecting this neighborhood. You should be grateful." I wanted to tell her to mind her own business, but I knew it wouldn't help. Instead, I calmly told her that there was no need to involve the police over something so trivial. A few minutes later, the sound of sirens approached. Neighbors began to peek out of their windows and doors, sensing that something was happening. I could feel the tension rising as 2 police cars pulled up in front of our house. Officers stepped out and approached the front door with caution, clearly responding to what they expected to be a potential emergency. My wife met them at the door, still composed and professional. As the officers introduced themselves, I noticed their demeanor shift slightly when she showed them her badge and identification. She had recently been promoted to police chief, a fact that none of the neighbors, including Karen, seemed to know. The realization hit Karen like a thunderclap. Her confident posture faltered, and for the first time I saw uncertainty and embarrassment on her face. The officers explained that there was no cause for concern, and that they were glad to see everything was fine. My wife took the opportunity to gently remind Karen that calling 911 should be reserved for real emergencies, not neighborly disputes or misunderstandings. Karen nodded stiffly but said little. The neighborhood, which had been buzzing with curiosity and speculation, began to quiet down as the officers left and the sirens faded into the distance. After the police had gone, I looked at my wife and couldn't help but feel proud. Despite the absurdity of the situation, she handled everything with grace and authority. I was amazed at how quickly she diffused what could have been a tense and humiliating encounter. Karen, on the other hand, seemed smaller somehow, her usual bravado stripped away by the revelation. In the days that followed, the story of the incident spread through the neighborhood. People were shocked to learn that the woman they had been so quick to judge and call in on was the very person responsible for keeping our community safe. Karen tried to save face, brushing it off as a misunderstanding, but I knew the truth lingered beneath her forced smile. Looking back, I realized that the incident was more than just a ridiculous confrontation. It was a lesson about assumptions, respect, and the danger of jumping to conclusions without knowing the whole story. My wife's strength and professionalism reminded me that sometimes the people we least expect are the ones quietly holding everything together. The moment the police cars pulled up to our house, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The flashing lights reflected off the windows and caught the attention of neighbors, who began to peek cautiously from behind curtains and doorways. I could feel my heart rate quicken, partly from the unexpected escalation and partly from the embarrassment of having a call like this come from Karen. What started as a minor annoyance had quickly turned into something much bigger than anyone had anticipated. 2 officers stepped out of the vehicles, their expressions serious but professional. They approached the front door with measured steps, radioing back to their dispatcher as they moved forward. I watched as my wife moved to greet them, her posture straight and calm. There was no hesitation or uncertainty in the way she carried herself, and it was clear the officers sensed that too. When she opened the door, she showed them her badge and identification. The surprise was immediate and tangible. The officers glanced at each other and then back at her, their demeanor softening as they registered the rank displayed on her badge. My wife was the new police chief for our city, a role she had earned through years of hard work and dedication. Somehow, this simple fact was completely unknown to Karen and most of the neighbors. The revelation seemed to deflate the tension instantly. Karen, standing a few feet away, looked like she had just been caught off guard by a sudden storm. Her usual confident smirk was replaced by a tight-lipped silence. I could see the embarrassment washing over her face as she tried to process what this meant. The woman she had just called the police on for something as trivial as ignoring the door was the very person charged with leading the police department in our area. My wife introduced herself to the officers with a quiet authority that left no room for doubt. She explained that there was no emergency, no suspicious activity, just a misunderstanding fueled by an overzealous neighbor. The officers nodded, clearly relieved, and expressed their appreciation for her handling the situation so professionally. One of them even gave Karen a polite but pointed reminder that 911 is for real emergencies, not neighborhood disputes. Karen barely managed a nod in response, her face still flushed with humiliation. I could tell she was struggling to find the right words, or perhaps deciding whether to deny what had happened. Instead, she just turned away, retreating back toward her house as if she wanted to disappear entirely. After the officers left, my wife closed the door and turned to me with a small smile. I could tell she was trying to mask her own frustration, but there was also a sense of satisfaction in how things had unfolded. Despite the ridiculousness of the situation, she handled it with grace and professionalism, showing exactly why she had earned her position. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, whispering among themselves and glancing in our direction. Word spread quickly about what had happened, and suddenly the woman who had been the target of Karen's accusations was the one commanding respect. People who had once rolled their eyes at my wife's quiet demeanor were now looking at her with a new appreciation. Karen's influence seemed to wane almost overnight. She still showed up at meetings and around the neighborhood, but the arrogance was gone. Instead, there was an awkwardness, a reluctance to engage as confidently as before. It was clear that the incident had shaken her in a way that no one else could have. For my wife and me, the whole experience was surreal. It was a strange mix of embarrassment, vindication, and a little bit of amusement. We knew Karen wasn't going to change overnight, but at least now the neighborhood had a new understanding of who she had been so quick to judge. In the end, the incident became a story we told again and again, each time with a little more laughter and less frustration. It was a reminder that sometimes people jump to conclusions without knowing the full story, and that true strength often comes from remaining calm and confident when chaos surrounds you. The days after the incident were anything but quiet. It felt like the entire neighborhood had caught wind of what happened and was buzzing with curiosity. I could see neighbors giving us nods of acknowledgement or stopping by to share their version of the story, often with a mix of surprise and amusement. It was strange to think how quickly word traveled and how much of an impact one small event could have on a whole community. Karen, however, was a different story. She didn't disappear entirely, but the way she moved through the neighborhood changed. There was no more sharp tone or confrontational stance when she crossed paths with my wife. Instead, there was a cautious politeness, as if she were carefully measuring every word and step. I could tell she was trying to figure out how to navigate a situation where the person she had so publicly challenged was now someone she had to respect, at least on the surface. One afternoon, Karen knocked on our door again. My wife answered, and I could hear the conversation from the living room. Karen spoke quietly, almost hesitantly, apologizing for the trouble she had caused. She tried to explain that she only called the police because she was genuinely concerned and that she didn't mean to make things difficult. My wife listened without interrupting, then responded with kindness and understanding. She reminded Karen that everyone makes mistakes and that the most important thing was to work together to keep the neighborhood safe and welcoming. That moment felt like a turning point. Karen didn't suddenly become the friendly neighbor we had hoped for, but the tension eased enough that interactions were no longer uncomfortable or hostile. We all seemed to settle into a new dynamic, where respect had to be earned but could also be given. The other neighbors also began to treat my wife differently once they knew who she was and what she did for the community. People who had been indifferent or dismissive started asking for her advice on safety and community issues. It was clear that her role as police chief carried a weight that changed the way people viewed her and our household. For me, the experience was a reminder of how easily assumptions can distort reality. Karen had judged my wife based on a moment's misunderstanding, without knowing anything about her background or character. It showed me how dangerous it can be to jump to conclusions and how important it is to approach others with an open mind and a bit of humility. Despite the changes, life in the neighborhood continued, much as it always had, with its small dramas and occasional frustrations. But there was now a sense that things might be a little different, that the balance of power had shifted in subtle ways. Karen's role as the self-appointed rule enforcer had diminished, and while she still had her supporters, there was a growing respect for the idea that kindness and professionalism were stronger forces. My wife and I often joked about the absurdity of the whole situation, but beneath the laughter was a genuine sense of gratitude. The incident had brought us closer to the community and had given us a story that felt like a lesson wrapped in irony. It reminded us that even when things seem out of control, staying calm and true to yourself can change the outcome in ways you never expect. In the end, Karen's call to 911 became more than just a neighborhood squabble. It was a moment that exposed insecurities, challenged assumptions, and showed the power of quiet strength. And though the neighborhood will always have its quirks, it now has a little more understanding and a lot more respect for the woman who keeps it safe. Looking back on everything, I realized that this whole experience was about much more than just a silly dispute over a doorbell or a neighborhood complaint. It was a lesson in how easy it is for people to jump to conclusions without knowing the full story. Karen acted out of suspicion and assumption, convinced she was protecting the community, but she didn't stop to consider who she was accusing or what kind of consequences her actions might have. That made me think about how often we all do the same thing in our daily lives, rushing to judgment instead of seeking understanding. My wife's response throughout the ordeal was a constant reminder of the power of calm and confidence. She didn't need to raise her voice or defend herself aggressively. Instead, she stayed composed and handled the situation with grace and professionalism. It was a perfect example of how strength doesn't always come from confrontation, but often from quiet resolve. Watching her navigate that ridiculous scenario made me admire her even more. The incident also revealed a lot about the dynamics in our neighborhood and the importance of respect. Karen had operated under the assumption that she had the right to control and police everyone else's lives, but she hadn't earned that respect. It wasn't until she realized who my wife was that the situation changed. That made me think about how respect isn't something you can demand, it has to be given, and it often comes from understanding and humility. Since then, things have settled down, but the story remains a touchstone for us and for the people around us. It's become a reminder to slow down, listen more, and not take things at face value. It's also a reminder that everyone has a story, and sometimes the quietest people carry the greatest strength. I don't expect Karen to change overnight, and maybe that's not even the point. What matters is that the neighborhood now knows a little more about who we are, and what it means to lead with kindness and patience. If anything, this experience has made me appreciate the people who quietly work behind the scenes to keep things running smoothly, even when no one is watching. In the end, I hope this story encourages others to pause before making judgments, and to remember that respect and understanding can change even the most stubborn situations. Sometimes, it's not about proving who is right or wrong, but about finding a way to live together with a little more empathy.